Okay, so we are continuing on Eruvin Pei Amud Bet by the Mishnah. So we've been talking about the amounts of food you needed and how it's scaled based on the number of people that lived in the courtyard. Originally based on a grogeret, and then it becomes the food for 2 meals. And then it stays at that for a while. So now that was the most previous discussion that we had in the Mishnah and Gemara. So now we're getting into going to get into details of what is actually valid to be used for your Eruv or for your Shituf. So Mishnah says, "Bakol ma'arvin u'mishtatfin chutz min hamayim u'min hamelach." Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer says everything works for making an Eruv or for making a Shituf Mevuot, as long as it's not water or salt. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Kikarhu Eruv, Afilu Ma'afeh Se'ah, Lehu Prusa, and Ma'arvin Ba. Rabbi Yeshua says, actually, the only thing you're allowed to use for an Eruv is a whole loaf of bread. And if it was and no matter how much baked bread you have, if it was broken into pieces, then it's no good. You need to make the Eruv with whole breads. Kikar kisar v'hu shalem ma'arvin ba. On the other hand, if you have a loaf of bread that is only the size of the isar, then that is a valid amount. Morning Shmuel, good morning Danny. We're currently discussing the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Pei Amud Bet. So we are at the Mishnah on Daf Pei Amud Bet. We are to talk about what you're allowed to make an Eruv or make a Shituf Mevuot with. So Rabbi Eliezer has the opinion that all foods besides water and salt are valid, whereas Rabbi Yeshua just explained that what you need for an Eruv is a loaf of bread, and not just bread, but it has to be a whole loaf. Even if you have a very large amount of bread, if it's cut up into pieces, that's no good. It needs to be a full loaf, and even if the loaf itself is very small, like the size of the Yisar, which is again much smaller than that of the amount that you make with a Sa'ah. So again, even though it's much less, as long as the main point is that it's whole. So you're better. So if you're doing for lechem, so let's say for our purposes, so better to use one of those little tiny itty bitty whole dinner rolls than use one of those massive loaves of bread that's sliced into pieces. Even though you'd think one's more bread, it's better, but for the purposes of Eruv, it's a problem, as we'll get to in the Gemara, for why all these beans why are big pieces a problem, etc. We'll get into it. Okay, so that's the Mishnah saying what foods are allowed. So now to pay Aleph Amud Aleph, Tanina Chadazimna Bechol Ma'arvin U'Mushtafin Chutz Min Hamayim V'Hamelach. So why do we need this Mishnah to say this? We learned it in another Mishnah that an Eruv can be done with everything except for water and salt. Right? With another Mishnah that says this. Isn't this redundant? Like, why do you need it twice? So Amar Rabba Lapuke Midar Rabbi Yeshua. No, you haven't stated in 2 different Mishnayot that exclude water and salt. Why? To exclude Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. The Amar Ki Karin Midyachrina Lo Kamash Malan Bakol. Right. So the reason is we're really trying to firmly exclude Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, who says that you can only do it with loaves of bread. So that's why we need to have the 2 places that's why you need to have the first half saying bakol with everything to make sure to include it. Make sure you don't think that Yeshua who says it has to be with just loaves of bread is the only opinion. So Itve Abaye. So now we're going to quote another Breita that has a different formulation, and we're trying to figure out how they're going to line up. So, Bakol Ma'arvin Eruvin Chatzerot Ubakol Mishtaf Shitufei Mevuot. So you can use whatever food you want for making Eruv Chatzerot or for Shituf Mevuot. The only case you need to use bread specifically is when you're making an Eruv Chatzerot. Man shamat leid amar pat in midyachrin alo Rabbi Yeshua Bakatani Bakol. So wait, so I understand. So who's the author of so what does that what does this have to so then this would explain our issue we had until now. The person who thought that you can only do with bread and nothing else, so that's Rabbi Yeshua. And the other opinion is saying Bakol. It seems like they're talking about different cases. So what's going on here? So Ella Amar Rabba Bar Barchana, Lapukid and Rabbi Yeshua, the Amar Shlema in, Prusalo, Kamash Malon, Bakal. No, we're not talking about the case of we're not trying to exclude the materials of the air. We're trying to point out that we don't follow this in that right. That's making sure to emphasize that you don't need to use whole loaves of bread. It's saying that you could even use pieces of bread, unlike what Rabbi Yeshua says in our Mishnah, where he says it has to be whole loaves. So this other bread, this bread is saying that even that we're saying that an eruv in a chatzeh, if doing an eruv chatzerot, meaning an eruv in a courtyard, and you're using bread. So this bread is saying that you could even use sliced bread or cut up bread, or bread that's been ripped to pieces is also good. It doesn't need to be whole loaves. So prusa my time alone. And what's so bad about having pieces of a broken loaf of bread? Like bread's bread, like it's still bread, it's still edible. Probably tastes roughly the same. Might be a little bit staler, but it's still bread. So Amar Yossi ben Shaul Amar Rebbe Mishum Eva. Why is it a problem? People can get upset, right? Because then you don't want people to. So what does that mean? Because people might turn another one and say, "Hey, why do you only donate that little piece of bread? I donated a whole loaf." But if everybody gives whole loaves, then it's not quite as easy to badmouth the other person. Yeah. So yeah. So that's just kind of how it is. Again, as mentioned before, everybody here is poor. So as in so if it looks like you've contributed significantly less than everybody else in the group, they'll view it as being very cheap and for stealing their food. So yeah. So thankfully that issue is avoided nowadays by everybody agreeing that we're all go in even Steven on the on the box of matzahs. It's there for all year. Nobody touches it until the following Pesach. So we don't have that issue. We thankfully avoid. So Amar Le Rav Acha Bre de Rava Le Ravashi. Okay, so Rav Acha asked Ravashi as follows. So Ervu Kulan B'Prusot Mahaba. What if everybody gave pieces of bread? So then nobody could be upset because we all gave pieces of bread, so it should be fine. So Amar Le Shemayas or Davar Lekulukulo. No, you're right. In this problem, it's okay because nobody's gonna upset. But for all we know, we might start going back to using whole loaves again, and then they're gonna get into fights again, and we don't want Jews fighting. It's just not worth it. Okay. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Shaul. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Shaul said, Nitla hemenu kudei chalata uchadei dimu'ah ma'arvin lo ba. So now we're saying what's considered to be a whole loaf. So if you had baked the whole bread, and then you're normally supposed to separate out challah when it's still dough. But let's say you made a mistake and you didn't. And then therefore afterwards you remove the challah. Or let's say if you one part of let's say the case of meduma, meaning if you'd had something that was truma that had fallen into chulin, meaning again, so truma is supposed to be eaten by the kohen with kedusha. Chulin is what everybody else eats after you separated out all the trumot and the maasrot from the grains. So if afterwards some of the truma falls back into the already separated out allowed to eat chulin, then it becomes dimua, and in order to make it mutter again, you need to be 100 parts. You have to have 200 parts of chulin to truma in order to negated. So we're saying that, so if you took out that amount, if you took out the amount of the corresponding to the truma, that would have fallen in. So in that case, is that eruv, even that loaf of bread is still considered to be a whole for the purposes of our eruv, and it still works. So, but the problem with that is that the hatanya kedei dimua ma'arvin loba ukdei chalata ein ma'arvin loba. Wait, so what? Yet we say that in the case of dimua, meaning the amount 1 in 200 of the loaf is no good. Whereas if you take off the amount you need for challah, then it is then you can, right? Why is it if taking off the amount for dimua for where the truma got mixed in? Why is that case amount okay, but the one for challah is no good? So what's the difference? So lo kasha. Now the difference is that the question is how much you take off for a baker versus a person. Because a baker, right? So even though midoraita challah is one of the things that doesn't have a shiur, but midrabanan we gave different amounts that you're supposed to do proportionately to the total volume for challah. We gave 1/24 for when you make home baked bread, and whereas it's 1/48 if you are a baker, because bakers making large amounts, so it'd be more financial burden for them. So therefore, the case where you took off a proportionate amount of challah, if you're a baker, took off that amount of the 1/48, it's not going to be a noticeable difference, and it's still considered to be whole. But if you took off the amount of that the BAYT takes off, meaning 1/24, that is a significant amount, and therefore it would be a problem. As now we're going, as the state of the Mishnah, sorry, I explained a little bit early. Shiur challah echad me'esrim v'arba. Right, so this is the Mishnah in challah. That the standard amount of challah midrabanan that you're supposed to use is 1/24. Hausa isa la'asmo of isa l'mishta b'no echad me'esrim v'arba. Similarly, whether you do it for yourself or for your son's wedding feast, again, there's also the year preparing everything. It's 1 out of 24. So this might be relevant nowadays, as some people are doing much smaller simchas. Unfortunately, because of COVID, so it actually might not be so crazy to say, "Hey, I'll make all the food myself." But again, that is difficult. I think my mom did it for my brother bar mitzvah when she was right before she gave birth to my other brother, and she's like, "I have no idea why I did that. That was insane." So, yeah. Anyways. But back in the day, people used to make things homemade far more frequently. So, right. So if you're doing it for your personal usage, 1/24. But naftom shu selim korbashuk. But for the baker who's doing it to sell in the marketplace, isha selim korbashuk, or let's say if a woman is baking to sell it in the shuk, achad marba'im mushmona. So we differentiate between personal usage, which is 1/24, versus the commercial usage of a baker or a woman who's trying to sell to make some extra money, then it would be 1 in 48. And so that differs between a little bit less than 2% of your loaf versus a little more than 4%. So 2% is noticeable, but 4% is, and that's why one of those would be an issue for using that loaf for your eruv, and versus for not. So also this could also be relevant in terms of when you're doing lech mishnah in general, it's considered to be more honorable to use a whole loaf. The question is, how perfect does your loaf need to be? So you can use similar guidelines here, because a lot of times when they bake them in the bakery, you'll notice that there's parts that are like look like they got ripped off because they touched the one next to it. When we were baking the bacon in the oven. So that little bit that that we get ripped on the side isn't really a significant amount. It still looks like a whole. It still looks like a whole one. So therefore, that's not really an issue. But on the other hand, if you wanted to try to take your pull apart challah, which was made up of 12 individual rolls, basically, and then separate it out, so then everybody notice it's both noticeable and clearly missing large chunks. So it would not necessarily work the same way. Just for a more hands-on example that people might have seen. So now back to our case of when are we allowed to make one loaf loaf one or not. So Amar Rav Chisda, Tvara b'kisam, sorry, b'kisam marvin lo ba. So Rav Chisda said, if you connected the two halves of the broken loaf with and you sewed it together using a wood chip, that's considered to be good. Tanya aim arvin lo ba. But didn't we say you can't do that? Lo kasha ha dia tifra ha lo dia tifra. No, the question is how good you did it at piecing it back together. So, because remember, as opposed to what we were talking about before, as opposed to the case, let's say in general you want to have a whole loaf of bread and it's for mishum kavod. Here, the whole reason is because you don't want people to start accusing each other. So if you're very good at putting it back together again, so it looks like it's all one whole loaf, that'll solve our issue. But if you don't know how to do it I know how to put the halves back together again, then that's no good. So if you've ever seen little kids at a simcha who like to we have those nice big hard rolls. They find it funny to take a little hole in the bottom, pull out all the soft spot, and then trade it with like the adults sitting next to them and see if they notice when they bite in, and they're like, where's the good part? So apparently that's a time-old tradition. So Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Shmuel, Ma'arvi b'pat ored b'pat dochan. So Rabbi Zera said the name of Shmuel that for eruv you could even make it with rice bread or millet bread. So meaning, and these are breads that you wouldn't normally be making hamotzi on. So, but they're still called breads. So Amar Mar Ukva Lididi me Parsha Li Mine de Mar Shmuel B'pat Orez Ma'arvin B'pat Dochan and Ma'arvin. So Mar Ukva says, this is what I heard from Shmuel. From Mar Shmuel, he said that that rice bread is good, but not millet bread. Probably because one of those comes out to be better bread than the other, and that's why. So Amar Bechia Bar Abin Amarav Arv B'Pada Dashim. Bechia said, in the name of Rav, you could use lentil bread. Is this really so? What do you mean? One time they used to make, in the name of marshmallow, they used to make this lentil bread, and it was so inedible. He gave it to his dog, and the dog wouldn't even eat it. So, right. So clearly that means it's not ro'el achilat adam. It's not ro'el achilat behema. Right. It's not. Human beings won't eat it. Even animals have a hard time eating it. So no. So the answer is no. Now there, the problem is that it was made up of mixed grains. The issue was, as we kind of said in Yechezkel, where you made bread out of many different types of grains, and therefore it's not considered to be fit for human consumption. But if it was made with just lentils alone, as opposed with all of these different things, it would have been fine. Similarly, nowadays that's not the case, because I'm sure as we've all seen when we go to our favorite local stores, they have 5-grain bread, 10-grain bread with more seeds than I know what they're even called, and they look just like bread and taste like bread. A little bit crunchier, but I'd say they're still edible. So what can you do? Rav Papa Amar Hahit Sluya B'Tzoat Hadam Havai. Okay, so Rav Papa says, why was that bread inedible that we're talking about in Yechezkel? Because that one was roasted in human excrement. Because as it says, you shall eat it as barley cakes, and you shall bake it with human excrement in their sight. So that's why it's inedible, because you apparently use human refuse as the fuel. Yeah, okay, that's gross. Okay, my ugat orim tochlena. So the first half of the verse, which says that you shall eat the bread of barley cakes. Amar chista l'shiurim. Don't read it as se'orim, read it as measures, meaning you will eat this bread and you will not be full. That's like the curse that the Jews are getting from Yechezkel. Rapapa Amar Arivata Karivat Se'orim V'lo Karivat Chitiv. Rapapa said, its preparation should be like that of barley bread, meaning it's a very rough bread you don't try very hard on, but it's not like a bread that you prepare properly, let's say for wheat bread, where you grind it all up, make sure it's soft, Barley bread is typically, a much rougher bread than wheat bread is. Okay. So that was the portion, that whole segment right there. Just let's do a quick sum up for now before we go to the next section. So that whole section was talking about what foods you can and can't use. So we ended up discussing first, the case that it can't be salt or water. We discussed that it has to be, that about it being made out of a whole loaf of bread. Why? And then then we discussed which type of bread. Why pieces of bread are no good. We said the issue is because people will judge you badly, not because there's a problem per se of using pieces, but because people will be angry at each other, and we don't want that, because the point of Eruv is to have us all join together, not just split us all apart. So yeah, and then we discussed which types of bread are good and not good, and we had some again. And then just l'chaf matzah at the end of the day. Nowadays we simply use matzahs because that solves the issue. They're all in one piece, and it lasts for a long time, and it's all very, very much processed, which is, say, all of the things that are mentioned here. Unfortunately, it's not quite as tasty as if you've been using fresh bread, but on the other hand, we're much bigger fans of the fact that it actually will last and be edible all year long, which is a very important part of the Eruv, because if the Eruv isn't edible anymore, then it's not an Eruv, because it's not food. So it has to be edible, and that's why we use matzahs. Okay. So now the Mishnah on the bottom of Pei Aleph Amud Aleph. So notin Adam ma'al chadvani v'lanachtom v'deshi zaka lo eruv. Kivrei Rabbi Eliezer. Eliezer says you can give money to the store owner or to the baker, and that way he will will acquire for you a portion of the Eruv. Basically, the baker would bake the bread, and then you'd use that later for the Eruv, and that'll work. So, and then the Chum Omru lo zachulo ma'otav. No, the Chum say, no, it's not enough just to give the money. That won't work. So, umotim b'sh'ar kol adam shezachu lo ma'otav. But on the other hand, the Chachamim agree that anybody else besides for a baker and for a for a store and for a shop owner, it would have worked. If you'd paid them, it would have made them be. You would be part of their Eruv then. Because when you're making the Eruv, the person has to know about it. Because what's the reason here? What's the reason behind this? Is because the question is, are you making the person, your shaliach, or again, we'll discuss more of the Gemara. It comes down to the case of is just a financial transaction enough of giving money, or do you need to actually do, as we mentioned before, is Zacchias, I'm actually lifting it up on your behalf or becoming your actual agent for the Eruv. You're appointing, saying you join in the Eruv for me, and seemingly just doing money isn't enough, because it's too non-specific for the baker, the store owner. But if you were to do a person, they would have understood that you are actually making them your shaliach fully, and then that would have worked. Again, we'll discuss this more in the Gemara, but that's the right. So then once we mention the fact that you have to make the Eruv to the person with their knowledge. So now we're going to discuss for which things you need, for which types of Eruv. This is going to say which Eruvs need your dad, right? Need the person who's going to be part of it to know that they're part of it. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, the med vermamurim the Eruv tchumin. When do you need to make sure the person knows about you're making the Eruv? By an Eruv tchumin. Because for an Eruv tchumin, it's not necessarily beneficial, because if the person places the Eruv tchumin in the wrong place, then it makes it more difficult, because then you have a limited area that you can walk, and if you wanted to walk east and the guy placed the Eruv tchumin to the west, then now you can't go there, and so it's not necessarily helpful. Aval the Eruv chatzerot ma'arvin l'da'ato v'shlo mida'ato l'da'ato lefi shezachin la'adam shelo b'fanav ve'ein chavin la'adam shelo b'fanav. On the other hand, for Eruv Chatzerot, you can do the Eruv whether they know it or they don't know about it, because it is a benefit for them. It is a zechut for them, and you can do that even if the person doesn't know about it. But you can't make somebody anything that could be to their detriment without their knowledge. So therefore, in Eruv Chatzerot, you lose nothing by being part of somebody else's Erev Chatzerot. It helps you carry in case you need to. Even if you yourself didn't want to use it, again, you lose absolutely nothing by them making Erev Chatzerot. But by Erev Tchumen, you could lose out, and that's why the person would need to tell you, and you need to then agree to be part of the Erev Tchumen. You can't simply do it and assume that they're okay with it, because you can't assume that. Okay, so now the question is, now we're going to discuss now in the Mishnah we're going to discuss how exactly does it work, the whole paying off the baker for your bread. So my time of Rabbi Eliezer, right? How is it possible that I can pay a baker and then be part of the Eruv? Because seemingly that's not sufficient, right? Because normally you need to do a proper, again. So halo mashach. So the problem is you didn't do Mashicha, right? So there's different types of kinyan. We say that in order to have a kinyan midoraita, in order to acquire something on a biblical level, you need to do some physical form of showing your control over the item. So that would normally be either hagba'ah, lifting off the ground, or it would be mashicha. If it's something that's heavy, you're pulling it towards you, right? Pull it into your area of control. So one of those two actions you need to do in order to acquire an item midoraita. Because even though you paid for something midorabanan, that's not good. When you pay, it's only on a rabbinic level, the level of acquisition. Until you actually have grabbed hold of the item, it's not yours yet. So, right. So that's the question. How could Rabbi Eliezer work? You didn't properly bring it towards yourself. So how is this working? So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Baravua, Asau Rabbi Eliezer Ka'arba'a Prakim B'Shana. So the answer is that Rabbi Eliezer established that there should be 4 times during the year when this acquisition goes into effect regardless. Nan, as we learned in the Mishnah, there are 4 times of year when we say midrabanan that we turn money acquisition into proper acquisition. And what are those 4 times of year? Okay, so from the Marashi, okay, Erev Pesach, Erev Shavuot, Erev Rosh Hashanah, and Shmini Atzeret. So on those days, you can force the owner of the animal, if you paid it for part of it, to say like, I want my food now, so we're going to slaughter it. So afilu shor shava elef dinar ve'ena lelokech el dinar achad kofin oto lishchon. These times of the year, you can force the buyer, you can force the butcher to slaughter an animal, even if you're only taking that amount, because if you promised to supply meat, then in these cases we consider the weight of that promise to be as if it was actually a full acquisition already. Okay, again, so this is only these 4 times of the year. Not any other times, and these times of the year would be different because, well, these are times when when everybody would be looking for meat, and it would be considered to be essential to have it. So whether or not is it fair? That's a separate question, but this is the takana that the Chachamim put in, so therefore that's the takana that we're going to go with. Okay, so because clearly there were big meals had then, and then if you are having it, then you have a right to say, I'd like to have it now. Okay. Oops. Okay, sorry, since my page jumped. Okay. Lefikas imate. Similarly, parallel to what we mentioned before about you getting the food, is that if the ox had died, that means that the buyer lost out. So what do you mean by mate lelokach? The buyer is lost out. Halo mashach, but he didn't do a kinyan yet. He didn't pull the animal towards him. Amaravuna b'shemashach. Rather, is that he had the mashiach on the animal prior. So he paid him his money. Does the mashiach is that way he's bought that portion of the moving animal, even though it's still alive, and then he gets it later. So ihachi, Aim a seifa. If so, then what about this? Then have the latter half of the Mishnah that Bishar Mot Hashana Ein Okay. That the rest of the year, if that's not the case, that that you can't force the butcher to slaughter the animal. So therefore, Lafikach Imate Mate Lamocher. So therefore, if he passes away, if the animal dies, it dies to the and therefore the owner of the animal is liable instead. Amai Hamashach. Wait, but why? That question is, so then why is the owner of the animal required, responsible to still give meat to some another animal, like the person buying the meat didn't do any mashiach, didn't show any way of his ownership. So why would he? So since he hasn't done mashiach, he hasn't shown acquired it on a biblical level. Why is he? Why? So then, right? So did he acquire it or not? It can't go both ways. So what is it? So no. So what's the case? So Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Olam B'Shlom Mashach. So what is the latter case? When the owner of the animal is responsible, it's when the buyer didn't do mashiach. Rather, what was the case there? Where the person had conferred possession by another person, meaning he told the other person to acquire on his behalf without having told him, and that's why we say it's the requirement, the responsibility of the owner of the animal, and not the responsibility of the other party. And so now we're rephrasing the. So now was that? So now that that's the case, now we're going to explain what we mean by the Mishnah about these 4 times of the year. So Bara Prakim Elu Diskutulo, right? So 4 times of the year, right? It's you can, and we allow you to allow the butcher to acquire it on behalf of the people as it's beneficial for them, and we'll let them do this act, and that is, and meaning Zachin Lo Shlo B'Fanav. So that's those 4 times of the year: Erev Pesach, Erev Shavuos, Erev Rosh Hashanah, and on Erev Shmini Atzeret. B'Shari Moed Shana Dechovulo. The rest of the year, where it's not beneficial to already be owning the part of the animal, and in case the animal passes away, you're not necessarily going to want the meat. Ein Chav Lo El B'Fanav. Then you can't make the person do Mashiach unless you explicitly ask him to. Okay, the Rav Ila Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and Rav Ila said the name of Rabbi Yochanan. But Arba Prakim Elu Hamidu Chachamim Divrei Mal Divrei Torah. So Rabbi Yochanan said that these are the 4 times of the year where the Chachamim said that their words will work as if they are D'oraita. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Dvar Torah Ma'ot Kono, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, Midoraita, money works. Ma'amru B'Shicha Kona, and why did they say that you need to do B'Shicha? Zir Shem Yomar Yomar Lo Nishafru Chitech Baliyah. So rather, so Rabbi Yochanan has an interesting opinion against that of the rest of the Chachamim, that really Midoraita Ma'od or Kona, that Midoraita money will work for money will purchase it for you at a biblical level. Rather, why do we require you to do some form of Mashiach? Is because we don't want the person to say, it's basically a corollary of Mishapara, meaning of the person who's people going back on their word because of, which will lead to a curse, because we don't want the case to happen where the owner says to the buyer, "I'm sorry, but your item is burned up, and therefore that's why you can't have that." Right? Because they burned up in the attic, and therefore the owner wasn't, the seller wasn't particular enough in saving the items. That's why we normally don't let. That's why the Chachamim say you need to do Mashiach, is because even though Midoraita it should be Kona, you should be able to acquire the items if you via just transfers of money. We say no because we don't want the seller to have it burned down in his storehouse and then keep the money afterwards. Okay, so Umodim Bishar Kol Adam, that if so now we're back to the Mishnah saying that the only people you can't do the money transfer for is is for the merchant, for the storekeeper, and for the baker, but for anybody else, you could. So man sha'ar kol adam. Who is the other people who you could do it for? Amarav balabayit. Rav says, who is the other people? Means any. It's not balabayit, right? Somebody owns like any average Joe. You ask him, hey, I'll pay you money. Can you make me be part of the Eruv with the loaf you're handing in? And then he could say yes. Okay, Amar Shmuel. Similarly, Shmuel says it's a balabayit. So, Amar Shmuel lo shanu ela nachtom of a balabayit kones. Shmuel says they only taught this about a baker, but for an owner, but for a balabayit, meaning somebody who simply is a homeowner, this is not the profession, then it would work. If you were to have given them the item. Amar Shmuel lo shanu ela ma'a aval kli kones. And Shmuel said further that the problem is if with the store owner is if you gave him a coin, but if you gave him an item instead, like a utensil, that would be considered to be a valid transfer. The Amar Shmuel lo shanu ella the Amar lo zecheli, and Shmuel says furthermore, when is it a problem with the case of the grocer or the baker? Lo shanu ella the Amar lo zecheli. The problem is that you said acquired for me. Amar arevli shaliach shaviyeh v'kaneh. The issue being is that he said zechia, right? That it sounds a lot like gain possession for me. The problem is there that it's very similar to a typical acquisition, so it might not necessarily work. But if you told the person, here's this money, make me part of the Eruv, arevli, then it means that you're making him your shaliach, he's your messenger to make you part of the Eruv, and therefore it'll work. And therefore you acquired. So similarly, Amar of Yehuda b'Medvar Memorim, right? Again, B'dat versus Shlom B'dat, right? Again, for your knowledge versus not for your knowledge, we say you can use them to your benefit, but not your detriment. Okay, so this is the question of Zachin la'adam shalom b'fanav, ve'en chavin la'adam shalom b'fanav, right? You can do benefit for him, he doesn't know, but you can't, you think it's his detriment without his knowledge. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yehuda says, "Name Shmuel, the halacha falls Rav Yehuda. V'lo od ela kol makom sheshana Rav Yehuda be'eruvin halacha kamoto." So Rav Yehuda, we follow Rav Yehuda in terms of the being beneficial, meaning that eruv chatzor is always beneficial, whereas eruv tchum is not. And not only that, but every case in eruvin where you see Rav Yehuda's opinion, we follow Rav Yehuda. Amar le Rav Chana Bagdata le Rav Yehuda. So Rav Chana from Baghdad is told Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, afilu b'mavu shnitul korotav v'lachiyav. But what Shmuel is saying, we always follow Rav Yehuda. Is that referring to even in the cases where somebody had removed the lechi of the korah on Shabbos? Amar le be'eruvin amarti l'chav lo b'mechitzot. So then the response of Rav Yehuda back to Rav Chana was, no, I said that for Eruvin, meaning for things relating to the functioning of the Eruv, the laws of Rav Yehuda, but not in regards to the case of the laws of Mechitza, the laws of walls. So those are two separate things. Eruvin and Mechitza are separate things, even though they often overlap. But since Mechitza is relevant for other areas of halacha, it is different. Amar le Rav Acha Brei de Rava le Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, halacha mechal pligi. If you say halacha is like a Yehuda, it implies that somebody argues. Does anybody argue about our case here? The Ha'amar Rav Yeshua ben Levi kol makom shamar Yehuda ematai uvemed mishatenu eno el lefarish v'rei chachamim. So the problem is that here, in our case here, is that we have another statement by Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that whenever Rabbi Yehuda uses the word when or in what case in the Mishnah, he's not arguing. He's simply explaining the law, the opinion of the rest of Chachamim. So who's going to argue with that? V'lo pligi. Are you sure nobody argues about this case, the Rabbi Yehuda? Oh, I'm going to show you kids people disagree with Rabbi Yehuda because in our Mishnah earlier, yesterday we stated that if there's more people come to the Eruv, you can add more food and be mizaka the Eruv and include those other new people in the Eruv. But the tzarech leodia, you have to tell everybody in the Eruv that more people showed up and are part of the Eruv now. So therefore, it would mean that you can't always simply do an Erev Chaser for other people. No, Hatam B'Chaser Shebein Shtei Mavot. No, there it's a different case because the courtyard is between two different alleyways, and therefore the person might have wanted to join the other one. So that unique case is a problem because you're right. That Erev Chaser could be a problem because it'll join into one Erev, not the other Erev. But in general, it should be fine. Amar Rav Shizbi, Amar Rav Chisda, Zod Omer, Chalukin Alav, Chaver Rav Yehuda. Rav Shizbi, then Rav Chisda. Then it still means to say that other people argue with Rabbi Yehuda in regards to the Eruv Chatzera being helpful. So Ella Gavra Karami, are you really arguing between these two? Mar Savar Pligi, Mar Savar Lo Pligi. Rather, we can make all this even easier. It's not really a problem. You're arguing within, again, maybe there's two different Amorayim quoting Tanaim. So there's an easier solution to this problem. That we've got one Amora, Shmuel, thinks that Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim disagree in the Mishnah, whereas the other Amora, Rabbi Shuv and Levi, says that they do not, that they actually agree. So and therefore that's how we solve the dispute. It comes down to much simpler than we thought it was. It actually is just a dispute in regards to which Tana or which Amora is it and how they interpret the Mishnah. So that solves all of our issues until now. Again, so just some of this last little section. So in the first part of today, we talked about what food you can use for the Eruv, and now in the second part, we're talking about how you could acquire your Eruv by means of using a baker or another person who you know. And we said that the difference between for a baker, you need to explicitly say, you are my messenger in order for that to work, you're a messenger to make the Eruv for me in order for that to work. Whereas for the average, if you were to simply ask a BAYT, you could do it with money because he would know that you're making him your shaliach for the Eruv, and therefore that'll be okay. And again, we discussed the differences between levels of acquisition, between money being only Rabbanan or it being Doraita, and in which cases and what times of the year. And we also discussed the case that generally we say that when you're making an Eruv, it's to somebody's benefit, not to their detriment. Okay.
A question?
Sure.
In the beginning of the Gemara, we talked about the challah. Rabbi Shua says you have to have the challah a complete loaf. But did you say also that if it's pieces and you can make it look like it's one, that would be acceptable?
Correct.
So an extension to making a motzi over sliced bread, would that fall into the same category?
I don't believe so, because the case of there's separate din. One is mishum kavod, one is mishum and one is because of mishum eva. Meaning the case we have of making bread is that what's considered to be a general din for Shabbos and Yom Tov. You're supposed to make the bracha on whole breads, and particularly for Yom Tov about lecha mishnan, two whole loaves of bread. So the 2 whole loaves of bread, that issue won't go away. That still needs to be done. Even if it's broken up, then it's no longer considered to be a whole loaf. So that'll be a problem. The reason why we say why thinking about it together works for the purposes of the Eruv is because the worry there is just that people are going to think badly of you. The issue is because of Eva. People are going to anger at each other. They say that you didn't give a full loaf, whereas he did. So Bikar Adin, it's perfectly fine to use pieces of bread for the Eruv. We just don't, because people get upset at each other. On the other hand, for Lecha Mishnah, you're supposed to use whole loaves, and therefore, even if you piece it together, it's not a whole loaf, and that would be a problem. But we did mention that that it has to be significant enough breakage off for it to be noticeably a problem would be relevant. That part would be relevant for the kavod aspect. So as in like a little bit of flaking off the top, or when 2 loaves of challah touch, that's not a problem for our purposes. But if you have actually ripped a sizable chunk off, that would be a problem. All clear, Shmuel?
Thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, see
Have a
everybody
good
tomorrow.
evening. Sure.
Scott.